This video will be part 3 of my coverage of Abraham Maslow's transpersonal psychology for PSY 230 personality theory. We left off last time talking about the traits and characteristics that Maslow believed self-actualized people possessed, and I noted some of the limitations of how he came to those conclusions. And you should, think about those limitations as we go forward to talking about behaviors leading to actualization as well. Maslow was really working within his own worldview and with his own within his own kind of set of operating assumptions about healthy behaviors and healthy personality, really grounded in his own Western ideology. So we also have to level some of those same criticisms to behaviors that he sees as directing the person toward actualization. Another thing that I want you to keep your eye on as we talk about these is just how often the behaviors that Maslow identifies will actually be consistent with things we will talk about in the chapter on Zen Buddhism. That won't be, I don't think it's next up, but when we get there, you'll notice some commonalities that really are kind of striking, when you take a big picture view of it. So what kind of behaviors did Maslow believe lead to actualization? First, he felt that it required a kind of cognitive attitude. You have to actually put your mind to the task. So he believed that people who tend to self-actualize spend time in deliberate concentration, where they are intentionally absorbing the world with full attention, with full concentration. This is one of those things that will be echoed when we talk about Zen Buddhism. There's a whole area within the perspective that focuses on having a right mind, and included in that is the ability to focus intentionally, fully, with full absorption in whatever it is that you are pursuing. He also, like Carl Rogers, believed that people have to see themselves as making choices, and this also echoes some of what Bandura studied in his work on self-efficacy. People make choices that promote growth when they are moving toward actualization. When they are not, they tend to be making decisions that go against growth, either actively destructively or just passively not growing. He argued that people who are actualizing work to be self-aware. So they make decisions, they engage in behaviors that intentionally increase their level of self-awareness. So he argued that people who are on this path toward growth tend to spend time thinking about themselves, thinking about their behaviors, and mindfully make choices to become more self-aware. He believed that that was an essential component to some of these self-actualized people that he was seeing. He believed they showed a remarkable level of self-awareness, and that included understanding their weaknesses as well as their strengths, and owning the responsibility for working toward overcoming weaknesses and using strengths to their fullest potential. Now, on this bullet point, you'll see a commonality with Alfred Adler. He, as was noted in that whole area of traits and characteristics of self-actualized people, he was big on the honesty thing. He felt that people, when they are going to be steadily moving in the direction of growth, they own their behavior. They take responsibility for what they do. When what they do is ineffective or in fact harmful, they own it and they repair it. When what they do is responsible for good outcomes, they own it, but they don't use it as a bludgeon to harm others. He believed that people who are moving steadily toward growth, as was the case for Carl Rogers, trust their own instincts. So if you're self-aware and you're also capable of full concentration, you will be able to see your judgments, the way you're seeing the world, with faith that you are accurate, or at least mostly accurate. If you're proven to be incorrect, then go back to number 4. You take responsibility and you move in a more appropriate direction. People who are actualizing tend to engage in behaviors that are functionally developmental, meaning they will put themselves intentionally in situations that will force them to grow. And that leads to the next one. If you are oriented in the direction of saying, I need to keep learning, I need to keep growing, I need to push myself, then you are more likely to have these moments, he believed, of pure self-actualization. And he called these peak experiences, which in some cases you can describe as mystical. In other cases, you can describe more pragmatically as being in a state of flow, or back to that mystical side, a state of bliss. If you're athletic and you've ever been in that quote-unquote zone, that would also be descriptive here. And then finally, people who are actualizing engage in actions both internally, so in terms of their cognitions, they decidedly avoid the use of ego defenses. So remember that Maslow was well read in the psychoanalytic literature. He was influenced by people like Adler and Horney. Ego defense is an anti-growth pattern. So behaving in response to ego defenses and having cognitions that are driven by ego defenses interferes with growth. So what people need to do if they are to intentionally grow is they need to use their skills of self-awareness, look at them with honesty and judgment, and then override them. So intentionally overriding, intentionally behaving in a way that is not defensive. These peak experiences, and Maslow spent a significant amount of his thinking time and writing time talking about these experiences. He felt that in his study of self-actualized people, they had in common descriptions of these events, these moments in their lives where they felt this state of flow, this state of mystical awareness that was a marker, according to Maslow, of a time period of intense growth possibility. So peak experiences, the way Maslow defined them, and again, he's going back to these people that he described as fully self-actualized. These people would write about these moments where they felt fully happy, fully joyful, where they may describe their experiences blissful and rapturous. In some cases, these were mystical or even religious experiences. In some cases, these were moments of appreciation and joy when interacting with nature. In some cases, they were more intellectual experiences that were described as ecstatic or blissful or joyful. So there's kind of an emotional component to peak experiences that is described by psychologists like Csikszentmihalyi as flow experiences. There's also, if you think about it in more philosophical terms, in more mystical or even religious terms, however you want to describe them, these are moments where, for Maslow, people had been working toward growth, and now they have a moment where they see and feel the results of that process, and they have this heightened sense of awareness and understanding of the world that they're in and of who they are within it. These peaks, and I've provided a quote here for you, were described by Maslow as seeing limitless possibilities, opening horizons. He uses words like that to try and put language on an experience emotionally and psychologically that is hard to describe. In some ways, he described it as an out-of-body kind of dissociative experience. And, when you talk to people who've had these moments of intense bliss, they often do describe that experience in terms that are in some ways dissociative. Some psychologists, when they, especially those who have studied dissociative experiences, either that arise of their own accord, or that have been induced through using psychedelic drugs, there is a shift in consciousness that has dissociative aspects to it. So I'm not saying that Maslow was really into the idea of let's all go take magic mushrooms so we can have peak experiences. That's not what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting, though, is that when people are in an active growth state and they are engaged, they are intuitive, they are self-aware, that they can have these moments where things, the product of that growth process becomes very intense. And it can be described as dissociative in a way. So here's a video clip of Maslow talking about, or being interviewed and talking about peak experiences.
The peak experience, the mystic experience, the oceanic feeling. Feelings of limitless horizons opening up to the vision, the feeling of being simultaneously more powerful and more helpless than one ever was before, the feeling of great ecstasy and wonder and awe, the loss of placing in time and space with, and finally the conviction that something extremely important and valuable has happened.
It's a very good thing for a person. Magic moments, in an article I read today, they recall. Well, there is some history here, which I think would be of interest. In my subject first, what I stumbled across, this I wasn't looking for, was what I had to call mystic experiences, or reports of such experiences. And I had come into this investigation with the normal equivalent of the normal person in the culture, thinking that mystical experiences happen to one saint, every century or something like that. And here I kept, people would talk to me in the same words as the Saint Teresa or Meister Eckhart or some of these other people that I'd read as the famous mystics. Well, I've put it down that way. And but then kept on discovering more and more that these came from many triggers. They came from all kinds of sources, from the love experience or the being on top of a mountain, or just being taken over by music, or somebody going along a seashore and then just going into this state. And I had to generalize it. And furthermore, I had to strip it of its traditionally, historically religious, specifically religious meaning, which turned out not to be. The peak experiences came from many, many things, many triggers. Once I tried to generalize them as anything that moves, anything that comes close to perfection. An experience of perfection will produce a peak experience. Whether in athletics, in one of my subjects, a young man breaking through with the ball into an open field and then running down the field and reporting in the same words that ancient mystics had used. This was a 17-year-old boy. Or totally stumbling across this by the purest accident of the women in natural childbirth reporting ecstasies, mystic experiences or peak experiences. So what I want to do is to generalize that. I found since that peak experiences do not occur, they're not the exclusive prerogative of one pantheon of people, but they occur very widely through the population. It looks now, and a preliminary statement would be that the higher the degree of psychological health, the greater the frequency of peak experiences, the higher they reach, the more intense they are, and the more illuminated, that is, the more cognitive they are, the more you learn from them. If you see the world in the peak experience in a more pure form, this can be remembered. Some people do remember, some people don't remember. The people who do remember tend to be changed, just as the ancient mystics reported.
So that gives you, in Maslow's own words, more information about how he was thinking of peak experiences. And notice the breadth of types of experiences, everything from athletic to scientific to religious and mystical. And the fact that there is consistency in the way people describe their emotionality, their thinking, their behavior in those instances. Now, he also defined what he called plateau experiences. Plateau experiences are kind of the, when people are self-actualizing, they can reach a stage, defined loosely, they can reach a point in their lives where they recognize a change, a fundamental change in their point of view. And this kind of reminds me of Kelly when he was talking about how personal constructs have to shift. If accumulated experience reaches a certain point where the person has to fundamentally change how they are viewing or understanding or interpreting the world, how they're interpreting themselves, that's very similar to what Maslow is describing as a plateau experience. As your authors describe it, it's a fundamental change in attitude, and it really, shifts your mindset. I've noticed in kind of the conversations I've had with students, with colleagues, with my friends on social media, in my conversations with friends and family, that over the last 3 years, I think there's a lot of people who have been really looking hard at how they view the world and their position in it, and it has in some cases pushed them to do a wholesale reevaluation of where they are and who they are and what they believe to be true. So plateau experiences in the Maslow model, when people are actualizing, when they're moving steadily in a growth-oriented direction, they may reach a plateau, and think of a plateau as a geographical kind of feature of you've risen and now you have a flat space. So you can grow and grow and grow and then reach a plateau where you are in a position where you need to sit there with it, to think about it, to understand it more fully. He described it as a state where you have a unitive consciousness. He does describe it in terminology here, simultaneous perception of the sacred and the ordinary. That is, hard to wrap your head around at first. But think about people in your life who who have kind of like the way Erik Erikson talked about wisdom, who have reached a point in life where they have long perspective, they have experienced growth and change, and they now have this unified way of thinking about themselves and the world that you could characterize as wise, that you could characterize as reflective and intuitive and holistic. He talked about plateau experiences, people who have these experiences, as living in a way that shows what he called awakening or illumination. So again, go back to the more commonly used terms. Think of people in your life who you would describe as living with wisdom, who are they appear to have a really solid grasp on what's going on around them, and they can communicate that to others. They appear to be enlightened, they appear to be wise and knowing. And I'm not talking about basic knowledge of how the world works. These are people who appear to be able to integrate the world in a way that is decidedly wise. He also described people who are in a plateau state as serene. So even in the face of a world that may be chaotic, that may be dangerous, that may be troubling, these are people who tend to use that plateau position, though, fully integrating the things that they have learned over the course of their development, integrating their various peak experiences, which are fairly short term, and kind of weaving them together into this state of plateau wisdom. So he describes these people as peaceful and serene in their emotional orientation to the world. He also finally described the plateau state, as a position of observation. So he described these individuals who were having plateau experiences as observers, very wise, very serene observers. And even if these were people who were observing things that were very hard, very difficult, these were the individuals who give people, through their observations, a new viewpoint, a new way of construing the experiences that they were having. Transcending self-actualization is another concept. It's kind of like, okay, healthy personality development means being self-actualized. So the ideal way of living is self-actualization. But wait, there can be more, according to Maslow. You can actually, and he identified in his research people who experience transcending self-actualization. So what are these people like? He argued that these were people who, and again, you're going to hear echoes of this in the chapter on Zen Buddhism, and also in the other two chapters that are describing so-called Eastern traditions. Transcending self-actualizers have a level of awareness that is associated with a shift in consciousness, and also kind of a grounding in the sense that we are deeply connected to all things. So Maslow is moving into a more transpersonal space here, and that's why his approach is often described as transpersonal psychology. So think about that word, transpersonal. So you're moving between and within, and you're changing the personal. Transcending self-actualizers tend to have a way of speaking about all things that is sacred. Not necessarily, frankly, religious, but seeing all things as having inherent value and worth and importance. These are individuals who see in the experience of life the capacity for transcendence, for shifts, meaningful shifts in consciousness, even just mundane daily tasks like think about cleaning or your workout. Mundane daily tasks that are often repetitive, he believed, are moments where shifts in consciousness actually kind of insert themselves. So, for example, he described you could have a person whose usual daily routine involves a hike or a long walk in a green setting. And as the person is engaging in that task, their mind shifts into these internal experiences of sacredness, a noticing of a transformation of color and light. Those transcendent sort of transpersonal experiences start to dominate these people's experience day in and day out. So transcending self-actualizers tend to have these sacred kind of experiences many, many times throughout their daily lives. Their They also tend to describe their peak experiences as being more fundamental to their everyday lives. And they tend to be people who think much more holistically about themselves and other people. They tend to describe themselves as much more intertwined with human experience, with the other sentient beings around them, and also the non-sentient. So these are people who tend to think about experience in a much broader, more transpersonal way, of seeing themselves as only, kind of a speck within the broader history of life, the universe, and everything, to borrow a phrase. As your authors put it, they're better able to transcend the categories that usually restrict and bound our lives. So as your writers say, they transcend past, present, future, and other categorical restrictions like good and evil, and instead perceive more unity and flow and complexity and contradiction, and are okay with that. So since they see the world and themselves and everything else in a unity, they tend to be more accepting of what are, if you don't have this transcending, self-actualized point of view, seem troubling, anxiety-provoking, even anger-provoking contradictions. He argued that these were people who tended to be more innovative, more creative, more original, and therefore they had a lot to offer. So it wasn't surprising to him, and it shouldn't be surprising to you at this point in the chapter, that Maslow would see highly successful people in the sphere of innovation to often have this kind of transcending, self-actualized point of view. Maslow suggested that as people acquire knowledge and experience, when they are transcending self-actualizers, excuse me, they also tend to adopt a stance of humility that is important, as it communicates to people that there's a lack of ego involved. With that lack of ego, if you're talking about people who are originators, who are creators, who are innovators, who are movers, these are individuals, if they are truly transcending self-actualizers, they humble themselves to the fact that they have been able to, through their own kind of mental work, through their own growth, be creative, be innovative, and so on. And they look back on their own work, their own experiences with reverence and awe. So how do we kind of pull these threads together and characterize from the Maslow point of view the process of psychological growth? You can take a number of approaches to this. Maslow was not particularly interested in child development. He was really focused on adults who were functioning in a healthy and successful way, which is unusual. If you look at your whole textbook at this point, you've read most of the book, and we're in the home stretch of your term. Notice how many of the early psychoanalytic theorists, they were really focused on child development and its importance. Maslow, less so. He was like, I want to look at health. I don't want to look at pathology. I want to look at healthy people and what they're like. So it's not surprising that Maslow's theory is very light on childhood and adolescence and very heavy on adulthood. He does assume that you have to get your physiological needs taken care of, and you have to satisfy all of the D needs, including the psychological ones. He felt that growth was necessarily interfered with if you are in a deficiency state persistently. growth moments can leak through. He argued it was even possible to have peak experiences in the midst of deficiency. But for people to grow at their most effective, they need to have their physiological and psychological needs met in order to consistently grow towards self-actualization. He did, in one of his less common forays into talking about childhood and adolescence, he did believe that a lot of early frustrations of needs, the D needs particularly, can have long-term impacts on people's tendency to move in the direction of actualization. So he did talk about, his version of fixation, using the Freudian terminology, was that, multiple early frustrations of physiological and psychological needs can fixate people, can get them stuck in a deficiency state. So any comment he's going to make about what's the cause of psychopathology, one possible is when people get stuck in a deficiency state, usually in that psychological needs realm in the middle of the hierarchy of needs. Maslow suggests that in order to get to the higher needs, in other words, the actualization needs, people need an environment that allows them to explore. As your authors put it, Maslow argues that fulfillment of higher needs is very satisfying. So when people find themselves in an environment that allows for that kind of exploration, so assuming that your basic physiological and psychological needs are in check, that they're basically okay, and that you have routine ability to meet those needs. When you're provided with an environment that allows you to explore and to, actually manifest your metamotivation, that people like it, they get excited by it, it's really self-reinforcing, and that pushes them beyond just deficiency level functioning. So, pulling those two ideas together, people are unhappy, you could say neurotic, maybe anxious and depressed and unhappy, when they are stuck in their D needs and they're not getting routine fulfillment of those needs. So they stay dissatisfied. When the shift toward actualization happens, people are moving in the direction of challenge, of expression, of exploration, that requires temporary bouts of feeling uncomfortable on purpose in order to achieve new things, psychologically and otherwise. So self-actualization in this model, in terms of how people grow, is a long-term process. People who self-actualized, he believed, have to make a commitment to themselves, to their growth. When people are able to move beyond the deficiency way of living, there are people, he argued, who, even though they get regular satisfaction of their lower level needs, their deficiency needs, they may still get stuck on a treadmill, basically, a psychological growth treadmill, where they're just keeping up with their D needs and not really moving beyond them. To move beyond them, you have to make an intentional move to force yourself to grow. So think about times in your life where you said, I'm stuck, I'm bored, I need to move, I need to change things. You may not have had a lot of those experiences yet in your life, and you may in fact be at a point in your life where you're feeling pressure to just take care of your basic psychological needs, because we're all stressed right now. The last 3 years have been hard, and they continue to be challenging and confusing. So all of us are really kind of feeling pressured to tread water a bit. So for Maslow, if we could guess, what would Maslow say about psychological growth in a pandemic? He would argue that take stock of your ability to continue to meet those basic needs and look for the moments of opportunity for growth. For example, I'm a dedicated NPR radio listener, and there was a story of how a group of musicians and performers, since they were locked down in the first year of the pandemic, they felt a desperate need to produce, to create, because that's who they are. But they felt like they couldn't do it. They couldn't perform for people. So in creating a moment, a place, a way to create, they used whatever tools they could find to create performance spaces and to put them out into the world. Think about really productive creators in spaces like TikTok. And I don't mean the majority of TikTok is fairly mundane, but there are some super creative ways of putting oneself into a world despite the frustrating deficiency aspects to living through a pandemic. Maslow would probably sit back and say, see, human beings are designed to grow. Even in the worst of circumstances, they find ways to find meaning, and to learn and to change and to continue to grow within their capabilities. So what would Maslow see as things that get in the way? And since Maslow was not particularly interested in psychopathology, he's a little light here in his theory. He doesn't give us a lot of information about negative developmental circumstances, so you're not going to see as much theorizing that is specific in Maslow's work in terms of obstacles to growth. He did believe that there are lots of experiences in our lives that can produce bad outcomes, and can result in developing what he called bad habits or poor habits. These could be associated with physiological needs being persistently deficient. It more often would be associated with psychological needs being persistently deficient. And that can lead to habits, behaviors, that range from the overtly criminal to just behaviors that are neurotic and interfere with growth. He felt that social influences, such as group pressure and conformity pressure, can push people to behave in ways that are not growth promoting, and that in fact can be very damaging to people. So, peer pressure, simple peer pressure can push people to behave in ways that are against their own growth promoting interests. He also felt that people can develop inner defenses. And again, he was so decidedly not focused on psychopathology that he didn't do a lot of theorizing in this area. But he didn't have a basic disagreement with the psychoanalyst either, that inner defenses can happen. So when people are thwarted in their psychological needs for esteem and belonging, they do tend to be defensive. So there are some basic ways in which this can occur. But he didn't spend a lot of time articulating a comprehensive theory of inner defense. So what are some of the defenses that he did identify? And I'll be transparent here. I find these two concepts to be hard to wrap my head around in some ways. In other ways, they're fairly simplistic. He used this concept, and I'm guessing this is the first time you've ever seen the word desacralization, but you might recognize it in people around you. If you kind of break apart the word sacral, sacred, if you're desacredizing, and that was a really not grammatical way to say that, but I think it makes the point. When people are operating from a defensive standpoint of desacralization, they show persistent lack of respect for institutions and persistent disobedience in the face of institutions. And they are particularly disrespectful of wiser, older people. You know people like this. And he felt that these were also people who were fundamentally distrustful, who question authority on a persistent basis, and they do so in a defensive way that interferes with growth. In order to combat this defense, the person needs to re-sacralize. So they need to be willing to see what is sacred. And he doesn't mean that in a purely religious sense. Religion may be a pathway for that, but it may not for many people. It may mean restoring faith in the ability to grow and to trust and to honor. And I think those are clear ways in which Maslow saw how do you pull back from being disrespectful, from being so disillusioned as to trust nothing and no one. How do you recover from that and regain some of your capacity to build relationships, to continue to grow through difficult circumstances, instead of really digging your heels in and saying no to everything unless forced to move otherwise. The second major defense that Maslow talked about was something he called the Jonah complex. Now, remember that Maslow comes from a Jewish tradition, Jonah referring to an Old Testament storytelling motif. And here's a situation that he described as people who actively won't grow. They know how, but they refuse to do it. So in a way, he's talking about super bright people, capable people who just won't move. Use the word lazy if you'd like. Use the words like intentionally stuck, failure to thrive or launch. I think in the 90s there was this idea of refusing to launch into adulthood. So these are people who are stuck in a childhood state of wanting to be taken care of, essentially, and then refusing, even though they're fully capable, to use their capacities as well as they could. So the Jonah complex in Maslow's mind is really intentionally just saying, no, not going to work that hard. I'm just going to stay right here, and I don't care if I'm not thriving. That he felt was a major defense of saying, being stuck in that mid-tier of esteem and saying, I'm afraid that if I try to grow and fail, I'd rather just, resign from growth than try to push myself, because what if I fail? So the Jonah complex essentially comes from fear of moving in a growth-oriented direction based on fragile self-esteem, essentially. So that concludes my coverage of Maslow's transpersonal psychology.